Imagine setting out on a journey that not only elevates your understanding of leadership, but transforms how you navigate personal growth and empowerment. Hear firsthand from industry leaders authentic stories, actionable insights, diverse perspectives, community engagement, and continuous learning. Welcome to Conversations That Matter. And now your host, Ed Ross.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to another episode of Conversations That Matter. I am your host, Ed Ross, and I am super excited to introduce you to today's guest, who is not only a former colleague, but I also consider her as a friend. In today's episode, we're thrilled to sit down with this guest, and she's going to tell you about her experience as a leader, not only as a trailblazing leader, but we'll also talk about the journey to get there and share advice that she would give others who are looking to be trailblazers as leaders. And here's the thing. Her story is one of adaptability. It's of being a visionary leader, turning challenges into stepping stones. And she's done all of these things in global matrixed organizations. So if you know anything about leadership itself is hard, but it is even more it is hard, but it is even more complicated when you're in a global organization. And then when you add the word matrix to it, it does feel just like that, like you are living in the matrix. So I am honored to welcome my friend and former colleague, Jeanne Farley, to today's episode. Welcome, Jeanne.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate that very warm welcome. And you captured it very well. Hierarchy and matrix.
Yes. It's challenging, and Jeanne, just to get us started, like so often people think about leadership and they're excited about leadership because of the opportunity, because of where they see themselves going. But oftentimes they don't know the intricacies that are required to become an effective, yes, but a good leader. I mean, the type of leader that people want to follow. Can you think back in your experience throughout your career? Or did you have the privilege of partnering with good leaders like that, who were the type of people that if they called today, you would answer the phone, number one. And then number two, if they said, hey, I'm putting together a team in earnest, you would consider listening. Not saying that you would move, but you at least consider listening because of the type of leader they were.
Absolutely. I can think of a few leaders like that in my past. And one of the things that I think is foundational for all leaders that are in that memory for me is they formed a team that was very connected and it was very personal. They were charismatic, but at the same time, they knew how to temper that with the right amount of coaching and feedback.
Yes. And it's funny because you mentioned charismatic. Most people think that that's leadership, right? Like you've got to be able to like wow and woo the people. But as you said, it's really about building a culture. Do you have the skill set to build a culture? And I like to use the general analogy, right? Like if you stood up in the front of a room and said to folks in that room, follow me, how many people would A, stand up and then B, follow you, right? Like you might get some people standing up going, wait, something's going on here. But how many people would actually follow you?
Exactly. And genuinely follow you. I think that's the other piece to it as well. There are people that will follow just because they think that's the right thing to do and they don't want to lose their job if they don't follow. But then
Yes.
there are the ones that will truly follow because they believe in what you're saying and what you're doing. And that's what really makes the difference.
Yeah. So I'm interested in diving into that a little bit, but I do want to talk about your experience as a leader, right? Leading large teams, leading projects, those require some of the skills that we've talked about at a high level. But could you share insights into some of those challenges that you've experienced personally, right? And
Yeah.
how you've actually had to embody those same leadership qualities and abilities that we just talked about?
Yeah, it's interesting because in your intro, you kind of hit the nail on the head, I think, because people that want to get into leadership generally do so because they want to help others. They want to take what they've learned in the past and now transfer that to others. And I think that it's a very altruistic thought at first. And then you start to get into the groove of what it is to be a leader. And you realize that's still what you want to do. But then there's so many other intricacies that you have to manage. There's organizational politics that you may have to battle through. Um, There's, projects that get canceled, put back on. There's a lot of moving parts to everything that's happening. And one of the things that I've learned the most is you have to really be able to kind of filter as a leader and
Mm.
figure out, what are the things that are really important for me to focus on? And then also, what are the things that are important for my team to focus on? Because one of your biggest jobs, I think, as a leader today is figuring out how do I make it manageable for my team? And what are the, I don't know, 4 things, maybe even less than that, that I need them to really focus on to get the job done. And every person is different. We learn that as we become leaders. You can't just blanketly, lead your team. You have to figure out each person individually and what's going to work best for them. But I think there's a lot of internal things that we don't think about when we get into leadership. And unfortunately, a lot of companies don't give us that opportunity to learn about that either before becoming a leader. It's on the job training, right?
Oh, yes, Jeannie, you're hitting on so many topics. Like, I wish I had my pad in here so I can write them down, but I'm going to try to recall them in order. I'm going to start in reverse order. In fact, that's one of the challenges that we face as leaders in global organizations, is really being intentional about how we develop our next wave of leaders. As you know, so often we take high performing individual contributors and then move them into a people leader role without actually providing them with the support that they need. And you can't just throw them in a 2-day class that says, welcome to leadership. It should be intentional and spread over time with a mix of introduction, reinforcement, application, measurement, adjustment, right? So when you think about those things and you know that these are some of the challenges, how have you been able to successfully do it throughout your career when you think about developing your team or an individual for that next level opportunity?
I do try to recall people within my past that were good leaders and try to fit, like what would so and so do? That's always a good thing to think about. Um, I think also now today, because we have access to so much information, sometimes when you don't know what to do, what do? You Google. And I know that sounds like so, I don't know, so cold in a way. I'm going to Google what to do with my employee or the situation. But
Right.
there's a lot of other people that experience the same things.
Yes.
And also through your network, if I don't know how to do something or I'm struggling with something, I might just reach out to somebody who's a peer that I consider, valuable and they have been down this path before. So I think that on the job learning really comes from learning from your peers, learning from mentors, learning from other leaders that you've experienced before. And yes, online learning as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that aspect of Googling. And I'm going to tie that to where we are today, right? We have the introduction of generative AI, and lots of people are trying to figure out how to use it. I think there's a vast sea of opportunity. There are also some areas that we have to be very cautious about. But I love the idea of just being able to leverage those things around us when you don't know, because there is a credibility risk of going to your boss and saying, hey, I don't know how to do this. Now, there should not be. Let me say that. My personal opinion is that there should not be. You should be able to go to your boss and say, hey, I'm really struggling to figure this out. We'd love to kind of talk through it, share some ideas, right? Don't only bring problems and answers, and be
Yes.
able to pose that to someone. But I also love the ownership and accountability of being able to say, I'm going to first start to figure this out or come up with at least a framework to which I can start to balance things. So I love that you introduced that. And Google is one of the great resources, right? Like, I date myself when I say this. It's like when we started introducing technology, everyone was afraid that we would forget how to do things. But now technology is embedded in everything we do,
It
right? From
is.
finish.
It
Yeah.
is. And there's, some great emerging tools regarding using AI and coaching, and there's probably some more kinks to be worked out on some of those tools, but they're coming. And I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
Um, it'll be interesting to see how they do get utilized
Mm.
because, we know the generations coming up are going to be expecting more digital interaction, and we need to be ready for that.
Yes, yes. We won't diverge, but as you know, we've
Yes.
built a platform, and we're super excited because every day we learn something. The more people we talk about, we're finding use cases that we hadn't even considered, and that's exciting. But as I said, on the other side of that, you have to balance the ethical responsibility that you have with AI because in some cases where you may be using AI to write, that certainly has some risks to it, especially in an academic setting. But for us, we're talking about leadership and people's careers and well-being. So we want to get that right. So I'm excited about that. I am going to transition a little bit and focus on the development side of the leadership role that you have. When you're designing educational experiences or strategies within the organization, that requires the ability to like anticipate these future needs that you and I are talking about today, right? There's like no, sometimes you build things and you're looking at that and you're going, well, we've been doing this for 10 years, right? As you said, we have a new generation looking for brand new things. How do you lead the change in implementing these strategies when, as you and I just said, there's some unknown factors about some of the technology and the ways that in which we can use it?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic because similar to many other things in our lives, we are creatures of habit, and companies are the same. And they may have been using a certain methodology or way of doing things within their company for development that has been there for a while. And they may be reluctant to look at some newer, interesting technology, but I think this is a great time to do it. So if you haven't looked at newer ideas in the past 5 to 10 years, it's the time to start looking. And I think bringing to light some of that data that we're talking about, like this is what newer generations are looking for. You're going to have to be really more cutting edge. And, there was an article that I read recently that said alpha generation, which is not even in our workforce yet, when they come, you think a smartphone is going to entertain them. It's not. You have to really think bigger and better and outside the box for them. So we're really at the point where we need to understand this new digital generation and provide some data to our organizations, inspire some conversation, which is what I really have been trying to do myself at this point, and bring us to some newer thinking. It doesn't have to change everything, but let's figure out a few things that are really going to be the most impactful. And the other key to this is stick to it for a little bit. The one thing that we find in a lot of organizations, I'm sure you recognize this yourself, is that we bring in a new idea and we try it for 6 months and maybe that's not going to work. So we try something else. You have to try something for a little bit longer than that to make sure it's going to stick. So that's another big component as well.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that, Jeannie, is there are things that we know that are more difficult to use, a bit flawed, if you will, that we
Yes.
continue to use, right, in our everyday lives. But
Yes.
as you said, sometimes when it comes to training or a new approach, we give that a very short leash and we don't actually give it a chance to, number one, for people to adopt the behaviors, number two, for us to actually reinforce and coach, and then number three, to be able to measure, right, the results from the implementation of that, the reinforcement and the coaching. And those things can always present challenges when you don't have those factors.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think, we did a good job during COVID to start embracing technology because we had to. And I think we need to now take that next step where we created blending learning. And I feel like maybe we need to create blended coaching now, whatever that might look like, and figure out how do we blend coaching into the everyday life of our reps and our leaders, and make it just a natural thing that's happening.
Yeah, and I love that because coaching shouldn't be a one-time event. It's coaching is a summarization of all the conversation that you have, and let's capture those that matter, right? Let's make sure that doesn't mean that you can't pick up the phone and call someone and have a general conversation about something, but if we're having conversation about revenue growth opportunity, again, technology can help us quickly assess those and identify what some best practices are so that we're more successful in those scenarios.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah. So let's talk about developing others for a moment. We touched on some of the skills that are required as a leader, but when you're coaching others towards success, right, that's a profound aspect of leadership. And not everyone is good at it. Can you discuss a moment when your guidance was pivotal in someone else's growth? And what principles do you believe are essential to be a good coach, right? I like to think of coaching as one of those things that we say often, but it's not always defined.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think, again, going back to that idea that we go into this being very altruistic, And sometimes people are chosen to be leaders that were successful in what they were doing in the past. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they can lead people to do the same thing. And so this is where, I think at least I've been able to really excel in some ways because I am able to help people figure out how to be maybe a better salesperson because that's what I did in my past, or how to enhance your skills because that's what I've done in my past. So I'm very fortunate in that respect that I'm able to transcend some of that information to others. And I think probably the most bright and shining aspect for me has been those that have been doing what they've been doing for a long time. And you give them maybe that one or two nuggets that resonates with them. And the way I usually approach it with a group, if I'm doing a training, is I might say something like, today I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know because you probably already know these things. And in reality, as professionals, most of us know what is good practice and best practice, and we're just not doing them. So sometimes to me, I think the best thing I can do as a leader is to remind people of what are the good things we could be doing right now to make ourselves more efficient, more effective, better at what we do. And it's really just a reminder because sometimes we just need reminders. We get lost in everything else in our day-to-day shuffle, and some of those things fall along the wayside.
Yeah. And I know, and I would imagine it's the same for you, going back to something that we talked about earlier, right? The diversity within teams. For the
Yes.
first time in a very long time, not only do we have multi-generational workforces, we have diversity in the globalization of the workforce. And that introduces all types of things that we as leaders have to be better at, have to have an understanding. So, how do you navigate the complexities of leading a diverse global team, but ensuring that collaboration, synergy, and all the movement toward the common goal, that those things are not lost?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, so having worked most of my time in a role that was specific to North America, now in a global role where you're touching all of the regions all around the world was a different experience for me. And
Right.
really learning to find out what's important to them. So having one-on-one calls with their learning and development teams or members of their sales leadership, that's what's helping me understand how, number one, how they do business, how they hire in their areas, what are they looking for typically in people, how receptive they are to training, development. Um, it's been interesting also for me to find out the differences in acceptance to technology. That's been very interesting. Um, some are much more advanced and cutting edge than others. So it's really just a learning experience. And I think when you're in a role that's in a global role, highly matrix organization, again, you need to take the time to just understand. That's number one. Without any biases, start understanding what other people are doing, what their challenges are, and what's working well. Because the next step is really to help them share with others if there is something that they're doing well. Well, can somebody else leverage that? So it's creating that collaboration amongst the team. I think that's very important too.
Yeah. And I love that. Again, I love your aspect of similar to what you said earlier, right? About asking. Like, if you don't know, go to your stakeholders and ask the question that says, how are things going? Where could, if you could have some new resources, what would they look like? Help me understand those things. We don't have to know it all to help solve those problems, right? It's an opportunity for us.
Absolutely. And the worst thing I could do would be to assume that I know, right?
Oh,
Be
yes.
the worst.
Yeah.
And just
Even
build whatever I want.
and we're laughing at that, but we know that happens, and it's primarily because of what you said before, right? We're so stuck in our habits as leaders and as educators that oftentimes we think that what we did the past three times, it's sufficient, right? I've got a lot on my plate. I can't get to the people that I need to get to, so I'll just go ahead and build this thing. And again, that introduces all types of challenges for us.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about this because communication is one of those pillars we must have when we start talking about diverse teams, when we start talking about global teams, and then we add in that matrix organization part.
Yes.
how has your leadership style changed as you've made your progression into the leadership role, especially at a global level? What adjustments did you have to make to your own communication style?
Yeah, I'm kind of smiling because it really has been an adjustment for me in some ways. Um, One of my strengths is communication, if you think of strength finders, but I have found I have had to fine tune this even further because I like to talk. I was a salesperson
Yes.
and I do presentations. So obviously, I like to talk. So in my communication, especially written communication, I try now to make things as concise as I possibly can because I have to be aware, number one, that people are probably translating what I'm writing to them. So I have to be concise and also very careful about the language that I'm using. So making sure that my message is clear, concise, and compelling is always the one that we think about. But honestly, when you're thinking of a global audience, those first two are the most important because you need to make sure that they're actually getting the message. So those have been two big things for me. On calls, also, I have to make sure that even just simple things, if you're presenting data on a slide, are you able to articulate that in a way that's very clear to the audience you're speaking with? So I think getting very fine-tuned, a little bit less verbose, maybe a few fewer jokes. You know, it's funny. This is kind of a little silly story, but we were planning a training that was going to be put out to all of our regions. And I thought, well, let's add just a little fun, the old tried and true Jeopardy. I didn't realize that's not a global thing. People in Japan and China did not know Jeopardy. I was like, what? So just
Yeah.
again, kind of getting that awareness and really making sure that you're in tune with your entire audience, not just the one you know.
Yeah, I love that. So often I've heard the term and I've used it myself, right? Think global, act local.
Yes,
That like resonates because you have to get to that level to where people understand things and they're aligned. The example I love to use is the rest of the world knows the true definition of football. Here in the US, we have our very own definition of what football is, right? And
yes,
so oftentimes, as a leader and as an educator, it can come across as if you've developed something that's in a vacuum in your mind that you're describing as the oblong football,
exactly.
while the rest of the world sees it as the round football.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's key terms we use all the time that don't necessarily mean the same thing. My favorite is standardization. That's so broadly used all of the time, but it doesn't mean the same thing to every person. So,
Yes. Yeah. And I'm going to touch on technology for a bit because I was telling you in our pre-call that I'm traveling in the midst of traveling. And yesterday I had a stark but good reminder of just how far we've come. I was on site at a location and I was working with two partners. One, English is not his first language, and the other, English is her first language. And as we were working through the project, she was using technology in the form of her mobile phone to restate our intentions and then play it in his native language. And he was in tune, aligned to everything we were saying. But I thought about how insightful that was for her, just to ensure that, as you and I were just saying, things weren't lost in translation, that we weren't using terms that don't fully translate over in real time and then expecting someone to commit with us to do something.
exactly. Some of those tools are great. And I think, again, they're another component I think that's going to evolve a little bit more over time and get even better. I mean, we found some of the translations are not always 100%, but they're pretty
So,
good. They're pretty good. So
yeah,
I think they're just going to continue to get better and better with AI.
yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the next wave of leaders. We've talked about those generations in the workplace to come to the workplace. What are some of the characteristics and traits that you're noticing as you're interacting with the next wave of leaders?
So there's a few things that I mean I've noticed for a while, and I think it comes back to the use of technology. Technology can be a wonderful thing, as we've talked about, but it also does take some things away from us at times. So one of the things I've noticed for a while, and I've been talking about this probably for 10 years now, is how it has altered our way of communicating. And by that, I mean, you and I are engaged in a conversation right now. We are virtual, but we're not texting one another. We're not using emojis. So it's a little different. And I think I've noticed when people are speaking, they are starting to lack some articulation, enthusiasm, where it should be emotional speak, if you will. So I think that's something leaders are going to have to get a little bit better at in the future. Maybe they're going to need a little coaching on how to speak to their group and sound emphatic or sound worried, whatever the case may be. So getting to be a better speaker and communicator might be something that we need to focus on with future leaders. I think the other thing is critical thinking, because we are so in tuned with looking things up. As I mentioned, I can Google this, I can go to AI. And that critical thinking starts to diminish a little bit because you're just getting your answer somewhere else. So I think we're going to have to really work on that piece as well, because we need our leaders to be agile thinkers. And you can't get everything from Google, let's face it. Somebody's going to argue that point, but
Yeah, and you know, the thing that often I like to remind folks is that the brain is a muscle, right? And like all
yes,
the other muscles in our body, in order to maintain their strength, right, we have to actually use them over and over in a repetitive fashion. So I
yeah,
love that you talked about critical thinking. I too love technology, and there are times when I'm working on something and I want a quick generation, something to generate quickly. As a matter of fact, we're working on a project last night, and it was wee hours of the morning. My body doesn't know what time zone we're in right now, and I was trying to prepare to shut down, but I had one more thing that I had to get done. And I was looking at these questions that someone submitted for a conversation that we're having today and we're moderating. And it became clear to me that these questions were not human generated. And as I read through the questions, I was like, okay, maybe I should just shut down because this question is not making any sense to me. It's just like, I don't know I have a sense of where they're going, but I don't know what they're trying to ask. And they want me to use the question as a way to get people to respond. I was like, this isn't going to work. So I pushed through, but that was an example of where it became clear to me that someone was probably under a time constraint, needed to get these questions back over,
yes.
right? Leverage technology, which I actually love,
Mhm.
but didn't do the critical thinking piece, which is, okay, after I've generated that, does this articulate what I want it to? Does it communicate in the way that I want it to? So
Yeah.
that we get what we hope for, which is engagement, insightful, comments, thought-provoking responses.
Yes, I totally agree. And it's funny you should say that, because when I've gone to Chat GPT, that is what I find as well. You can tell it sounds very computer generated. And I think that's what a lot of people are becoming used to. But again, I go back to thinking of a leader really needs to have that charismatic element. And you only get that from being a person. You can't
Yes.
get that from Chat GPT or Google. And so
Yes.
how do we make you more charismatic and more human? Well, we need to make you a good critical thinker, and you need to be able to communicate as a human.
And I would add that other piece, which is that executive presence, right? Like you and I have had the benefit of working for the same company, and we can
Yes,
probably name some of the same leaders that when they walked in the room, there was something about them even before they addressed the audience, right?
absolutely. I would
And
agree.
those are the elements that I believe, while technology is great, we're not going to reach a point where you can replace, good leaders with technology. You may be able to replace some bad leaders, and I know people don't like that term, but let's be honest. We've all worked for people who we would not work for again in any condition. I don't consider them to be ineffective. That is a bad manager, right? So we do
Right.
have those. So AI can potentially, filter some of those people out, but your good, average, and then exceptional leaders, there's just I don't foresee a day and time when innovation and technology will be able to replace them because of those elements that we talked about, such as executive presence, empathy, emotional intelligence.
Exactly. It will be interesting to see how AI can help us to filter out some of those people in the future. And I know we've all been experienced to various behavioral assessments, et cetera. entering a potential role. But I think that can even get better as time goes on. And, not ways to trick the system, right? I mean, people figured out over time, like, well, I just need to answer like this. And I think AI can help us get better at filtering and putting people in the right roles. It's not to say, oh, you're not a leader, that's a bad thing. There's a better role for you, more suitable role. And I think we need to figure that out as well.
Yes, and because there's something special about when you're operating within your own zone of genius, right? Like being in that space, just doing the things that bring you joy, that are exciting, that are invigorating, right? That you're really good at. There are a few things that actually can substitute for that.
Exactly. We want everybody to be in their element.
Yes, yes. So with that, what would you say to leaders that are listening today? Maybe they're emerging leaders, Jeannie. They haven't reached, their organization hasn't identified them yet as a formal leader, but they want to do some things to move closer to the types of leaders that you and I have raved about throughout this episode, that you talked about, the types of leader, the type of leader that you are. How do they get started when they don't have the organization making that investment or identifying them yet? What tips, insights, and strategies would you recommend?
Yeah, I think there's some simple things that leaders can do with their teams today that doesn't cost anything for any company. And hopefully some managers will hear this and say, yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing right now. But think about the Monday morning quarterback, right? They get on the call on Monday morning, 8 or 8:30 with their team, and you're running through everybody's deals. You're just running through them. This isn't going to work. When's that coming? What's the dollar amount on that? And the call is over. And wouldn't that call have been more beneficial? Because I'm thinking about back when I was a sales rep and I used to have those calls with my manager and the team was on. What happened after you did yours? Did you listen anymore?
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
And you actually tried to go first, so you didn't have to listen to the rest of the call, right? So that's kind of how it went. But I think if managers started incorporating more conversation and collaboration right there with their team, that's going to open up more dialect, more charismatic elements for that leader to say, all right, let's all talk about Ed's deal a little bit here. Do you have any ideas for him? And get the team talking together. Because I think one of the things that is challenging for any leader today is that reps have become more and more siloed on your teams. And we want to make them feel together. We want to get that connectedness going. And right there on your Monday morning call, start it next week. Start asking some collaborative questions from your team so that when I'm done giving you my rendition of what my opportunities are right now, I don't shut down.
Yes.
Keep me involved. And you'll be surprised maybe what you get from that call. It'll be a whole different experience for the team.
Yeah, I love the intentionality behind that. I also love the fact, Jeannie, that starts to build a culture of collaboration within your team. And
Yes.
before you know it, with consistency and feedback and development, they can start to have those conversations in absence of their managers. And I know, thinking back to my sales career, I loved when there were times when I could pick up the phone and get a different perspective on addressing or responding to a situation, and then making then making a decision based off what I knew was best interest of my customer or aligned to their goals. But having that ability to connect with someone else to get their perspective on the same challenge, it's one of the reasons that I love our approach to immersive learning, right? You're able to cross-pollinate, so to speak.
Exactly. And, again, the Y and Z generation that we are kind of getting the influx of right now, they like collaboration. Maybe
Yes.
X doesn't like it as much because they were the latchkey kids that did everything on their own. That's my generation. But the collaboration is big for those generations. So utilize that mindset and see if it changes your team meetings. See if it changes, the next time they're looking to collaborate with somebody, do they just reach out and do it proactively, to your point?
Yeah. Jeannie, when we started this podcast, one of the things that we wanted to do was bring unique perspectives that were real and relevant and practical. And that's why I reached out to you as soon as we decided that we're going to go for it. Today's conversation is an example of why we wanted to have you on it, because we want to introduce things that people can apply right away. Not something that has to go and sign up for some course and learn some, theory or philosophy behind it, what they could do today. So I want to thank you on behalf of our listeners for keeping things simple and giving them things that they could use right away, because that's not always the case. And I know our listeners today are, like me, moving around the country. They may be on the bike at home. They may be on the treadmill. They may be at the gym. They've got lots of things going on in the background. And I just appreciate the way that you've made everything so digestible, so concise, and so simple and straightforward.
Well, thank you. It has been my pleasure to have this chat with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So to all of our guests, I want to close by asking you, how can people follow your journey as a leader? How can they reach out and just get more perspective on your experience leading and developing those around
For
you?
me, they can go to LinkedIn for sure. I am on there on a daily basis, checking out what's happening in all the industries.
Awesome. Awesome. I love it. Well, again, Jeannie, on behalf of our entire team here, thank you for making time for us today. Thank you for sharing your insights with our listeners. And for our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe using the button. Simply subscribe. When these new episodes drop, you'll be amongst the first to know. You can dive in and take a listen to leaders like Jeannie. And I want to thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Conversations That Matter.
Thanks for listening to Conversations That Matter with Ed Ross. By subscribing to Conversations That Matter wherever you get your podcasts, you're taking a step towards becoming the leader you aspire to be. Subscribe to Conversations That Matter today and be part of a community dedicated to creating meaningful change, one conversation at a time.